There are three major reasons why paying attention to what your child is eating on their plate could literally change the outcome of their lives. So I'm going to dive into some of the questions and comments that we get often in our calls, our connection calls, when we're discussing our program with people as to why is the food so important? And if it's just food, can I figure it out myself? So let's have a conversation on the DIY aspect. Let's talk about why food as medicine is so under-researched and yet exploding in the coming years. So let's dive into three reasons why this is the most foundational, important thing you need to be paying attention with your child who is on the spectrum, potentially not verbal, and who you would do anything to hear their voice or see their behaviors diminish.
One of the things that we currently or in the past believe was that autism was a complete neurotype and that there was 1 in 10,000. And I'm not here to argue that. This is the actual definition of autism: an individual who has challenges in social communication and interactions, repetitive patterns, special interests, and are under this definition on how they diagnose autism. And the severity is what we call the spectrum. Now, I want to share something about what's not autism, but yet now is talked about as if it is part of autism. And these are actually not truths. So what a paradigm shift everybody's thoughts on the behaviors, the symptoms of what is not autism and what is. So things that are not autism are speech regressions or the inability to communicate, aggression, anxiety, depression, not potty trained, constipation, recurrent infections or co-infections, processing disorders, and comorbidities. Even though these are now really bulked under this really big, broad umbrella, these are not autism. And so regardless of if autism is a neurotype, and I still think that there needs to be more research on this, but I am not someone who's rigid. I think that everyone deserves to be accepted. And if they want to continue on that journey, that's fine. But ideally, more research is needed on both sides, right? But regardless of if autism is a neurotype and we still have 1 in 10,000, what we're seeing, the symptoms that many of these kids suffer from are not because of autism. And so where are they coming from? So I want to offer that autism, I'm going to give you guys a biological lesson, a little bit of anatomy lesson, because I know I get this question a lot. So I thought I would bring you through what's happening with our kids today. What's happening to their brain? What's happening to their livers? Why are they all of a sudden struggling? Why do 50% of classrooms sometimes need an IEP? That is not normal. That is not what is in the past. Why are we lowering, right, the milestones? Why are we changing them? When we think that milestones are made to be reached at a certain age, and now we're extending the milestones for speech, that's not good questioning and good science. We should be questioning, first of all, why are we not reaching these milestones for our kids anymore? Why are they all delayed? And I'm going to give you an overview of the 3 areas that I know, based on research that is coming out, based on courses and certifications that I have done, what is actually happening in our world today with our kids. So let's dive in.
All right, in a very short explanation, I want to ask you a very high level question. Does your child with autism follow the same anatomical rules as all humans? And the short answer is yes. And I'm going to dive into why that, which is our chemistry deep down. Just thinking about our body all the way down is just molecules that move close together. I'm not going to dive into that part because that gets a little bit too deep. But when we look at the next layer, which is our chemical layer, which is where hormones are, dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, all of these things are internal structures that are physical, that our children on the spectrum and neurotypical children and adults like myself all have. And so we need to have support for these areas. So no child of any condition is exempt from the need to have their biological pathways supported with nutrition and the foundations and lifestyle. The second piece is cellular structures. So our cellular structures are all the same. We have nucleuses, we can have inflammation or we can have no inflammation, but the structure are the same in the sense of we all have liver cells, we all have neurons, we all have kidney cells, and we all have skin cells. Your child on the spectrum has the same cells that a neurotypical child has, and needs an internal support that is the same, which means they need to have foundational health, or they're going to end up with some of these issues that have nothing to do with autism and are completely lifestyle driven. The third part is to look at our organs, and all of our organs are the same. The child on the spectrum has a brain, and yes, the connective pathways in it may be slightly different, but it still needs neurons, it still needs receptor sites, it still needs neurotransmitters and axons. So physically and biologically and anatomically, your child has all the same requirements as a child that is neurotypical. And we have created a little bit of a non-health halo around autism children, where we think that their picky eating or sensory processing is part of the condition, but truthfully it's a cycle of lifestyle illness. And we can help our children on the spectrum thrive, especially if they're suffering from these related issues, with a food first approach, knowing that biologically that's what we all need. You would never question if I was extremely overweight and I had diabetes and potentially cancer. You would never discourage me from going and taking a lifestyle journey to better my health, which we now know and have a ton of data is going to be what is linked to longevity and to reverse my conditions. So why are we, my question to you is, if our children follow the same anatomical rules as all humans, why do we put this halo around them that exempts them from this? So quality questions, ask you that before we hop on our call. I think it's such a good way to get the ball rolling in our brains for mindset and belief that this can happen for your child. Because once you believe your child really does abide by biology and by the same similar structures, it means that they can heal if they have any of these conditions, again, that are not autism related. And we talked about that at the definition of autism. So regardless of if your child has some of those quirks, we'll say that they're a little less social, but they have special interests, they can still be independent and they can still provide those gifts to the world, and everybody benefits. But if they have, this is very supported. These are lifestyle illnesses. So let us dive into the rest of the call and to the rest of the video. And I hope that this really started the little mindset wheels turning on a food first approach being really supportive to your child. So let's dive in the meat and bones of the anatomy and why autism or autism-like symptoms or even non-autism symptoms are showing up in our kids today, because I think that's really the best question we can ask ourselves. And I want to talk a little bit about the gut microbiome first. And the three areas that we're going to talk about is toxicity, nutrition, and gut microbiota, and basically our microbiome. So what we have when we're born is we are built out in our mom's tummy, and we don't have a lot of exposure to building a microbiome other than the little bit of amniotic fluid that we swallow. Our biggest bulk of microbiome at the beginning is through the birthing canal, where we swallow, and our eyes, and it goes in our nose, that our mom passes down some of her microbiota through the vaginal canal. So if your child has had a C-section, or you had a C-section, that means that didn't happen. That means that there was already a little bit of a lack of start that started. And so they found a big correlation with asthmas and illnesses with kids who are definitely a C-section, and it's impacting their immune system. So the next thing to look at is the next area, where do we build our microbiome? And again, your child is a human being and still needs to have these microbes. What they've studied is that children on the spectrum are missing very specific microbes all throughout. So when we have evidence that a large body of people are suffering from the same condition and has one, we need to be paying attention. So the other area where we look at lack of little breast milk next is where we're going to get it. We're going to get our next boost through colostrum first, which gives us a boost, and then also through breast milk, which also impacts our microbiome proliferation, but also helps with our immune system. It's actually our only immune system support at the beginning. So now if you had a C-section and then you also didn't breastfeed, your child would have had a little bit of a harder start. Now, from there, not what builds out most of the microbiome though, just so you know. The news is that the ages of 1 to 5 is when we truly create the diversity that we need. Our microbiome, like what at birth, it can only survive if we continue to offer it the foods that it needs, for the microbiome are actually starches that we can't digest. which are resistant starches, which are all of the different fibers that can come from the diversity of fruits, vegetables, legumes, beans, and then of course like nuts. So when we look at the first foods, what do we do here in the United States and Canada and even in Europe now? Our first foods went from being things that were either masticated from our parents in their mouth, or they now come from grains, which was not what we were initially meant to eat. Although grains and whole grains are very good for us, don't get me wrong, I'm not a GAPS. I don't do wheat in our program for a very good reason. They have a ton of amino acids for brain development. So, but when we look at the lack of diversity and our first foods are just grains and then bringing into small amounts of fruits and vegetables and then going straight into meat products, we actually find a lack of diversity. We're not giving the body everything that it needs. And I know that this is a huge thing for question, that with all of the different information coming out there on carnivores, I just want to say that longevity and all of the data that we have currently for long-term studies show us that we actually do need vegetables and fruits and grain to actually feed the microbes. So what we get from meat are already converted nutrients, and they do help because everything is an elimination diet. But the goal at the end of the day is that those are not what's feeding the gut, and the gut is what's keeping us alive. When it dies, if we kill our microbiome, we die. If we die, it dies as well. So I want to offer a little bit of the things that do impact our microbiome really quick, is that antibiotics and toxins, also those are in the same family. These can come from anything like parasites, foods that we eat, and I'm going to talk about toxins in a minute, it'll kind of lead me into there, is that it will deplete the gut. Now, contrary to what we believe, our good bugs can also be bad for us. If we're not feeding our gut the fibers that it needs, which you can only get from food, even prebiotics are not there yet, we actually can feed the microbiome with a pill yet, or a powder, or anything like that. So when we look at the only thing we can pretty much give it sometimes is Metamucil, and that's only one type of fiber, and they need multiples. So what we need to be looking at is, oh, my battery's low. What we need to be looking at specifically is that we need to be offering the fibers that we need from those fruits and vegetables, which is why the food first approach is so important. I'm sure that I think helped you to see why we want to do that. A lot of the foods that are specific to the microbiota are actually going to a very sealed and tight gut wall. When we have a sealed and tight gut wall, it means that foods cannot transport through it and go back into the bloodstream, where it can cause things like histamine responses, allergy, inflammation throughout the and in the brain. And when our children are under the age of 5, there's a highway right here that goes from the gut all the way to the brain. And it is then what we normally have as adults until our bowels are developed, and then it gets a little bit smaller and it closes off a little. So when we have 90% of the information going from the gut and into the brain, which is called the gut-brain axis, that means that if we're providing our children with inflammatory foods like dairy and gluten and some of the other, processed foods and herbicides, it means that 90% of that information is going up to the brain. That includes also if we are depleting our healthy microbes, the other microbes that are not so helpful can grow. And then they can also go up. So if you've ever heard of pans and pandas, and if you haven't, don't worry, you can just that. But when we hear about pans and pandas, it's actually because some of those bad microbes have actually been able to go up through there, and the blood-brain barrier is made out of the similar cells as the gut wall. So the T-junction cells, and our blood-brain barrier has similar cells called T-junction cells, that are very both in the gut wall and in the brain barrier, that usually keeps the stuff that doesn't belong in there out. So that brings us to toxins. So now that we know what depletes it, we know that this is a very important part of us living. It is literally like we are an ecosystem, like we are separate, yet we need each other to live. So knowing that importance, it brings me to toxins and how they can harm the human body. So as you can tell, most people will show you a picture of a child that is like the toxic load very high. And what happens then is people will say that, it just is true in a way. But ideally, I want you guys to think of the body as a little bit deeper. I want you to have more, better information. It's actually each organ that starts to get full. Each organ has its own ability to remove toxins. The brain even has its own, it remove toxins during sleep. and it's called the glymphatic system, not the lymphatic system, but the glymphatic system. We teach about that in the program. But ideally, when all of these areas start to get full, and it starts in the liver, most ignored organ in the body for autism, which never needs to be ignored. If you have a nonverbal child, they likely have a full liver. So let's talk about how that happens though first. So toxins, airway, how do we get them? There's only 3 ways. We breathe them in, and we know that now there's tons of data that shows that air pollution in cities, children on the spectrum are like, this actually creates autism because it increases autism symptoms. Our children are smaller, they breathe faster, which means that they are breathing in and out more of that toxic material than we do as adults. So that is one area, cleaners, things like that. Anything we can breathe in that is going to harm a cell. A toxin just means harming a cellular structure that is if you're a physician watching this, because we do have a lot of physicians come for these calls, or nurses or professionals, and they really they struggle with the idea of what is toxicity, what is a detox system, is this a fad? And you actually use the system all the time when you're actually, just say you have a patient that's going to emerge with a Tylenol toxicity, you're going to give them NAC. Okay, a NAC is just something that opens up one of those pathways. Detox pathways are biological pathways that they're basically elimination. And now we know that every organ has the capacity to eliminate. The problem is that it's in our day to day, we've created 80,000 more chemicals. We have many of those not tested for human safety. We have way more exposures to heavy metals, bringing them in and using them in our products. And so all of these need to find their way out. And so if our toxic burden has gone up for an adult, a lot of people are like, well, why does it affect kids more? When they are born, unlike what used to be believed, their systems need micro exposures to actually build. So that means that they're cleaning, starting with a clean slate, except that clean slate is very, very impacted because of the vagus nerve. So if there is a toxin, whether they eat it, breathe it in, it's going to go to the liver first, and then it's going to go into the bowels, and then it's going to go straight up to the brain. Makes sense, right? So the liver dumps all of this it doesn't want in there back into the bowel system or into the kidneys, and then it pushes it out. If there's too much of a toxic burden, what happens? Well, some of it will go back through the skin, the microbiome will be depleted, and then we're just kind of ending up. The other way that we can get toxins in is through ingestion, so we eat them. And then that's like pesticides, herbicides, it could look like parasites in meat, it could look like ultra-processed preservatives, dyes, all the things. So anything that goes into this eventually go into the liver, which then the liver again is one of the more impacted. So at the beginning of a child's, the liver, which delegates, okay, liver has 500, my friends, delegates all the nutrients that are supposed to go to the brain, all the antioxidants that are supposed to help protect damaged cells, free radicals. So basically the liver, if it's not functioning, that's the starting process of what's happening with your child. And everybody talks about the gut, nobody talks about the liver. We take a liver first approach and then a gut approach because the liver is such a key player. Otherwise, we're always recirculating things, and the liver is always going to, if it's full, it basically says, I can't do this, I'm tired. It takes all of that stuff that it's trying to process and puts it into the children's fat cells. And so these expand, and so what they do is they just hold it for safety for later processing. But if we never give it the chance to process, that means that we're storing large amount of toxic material in our bodies as a safety mechanism. Okay, so ingestion is a huge one, and then topical. So if your child had baby wipes, had disposable diapers, had basically any of this from Johnson & Johnson or any of the topical things with fake essential oils, remember that essential oils are also considered, that they use large companies, are not usually high quality essential oils and basically are just fragrance, which is code word for 4,000 potential chemicals. So if we're looking at the toxic burden that our children are getting today, it is basically in 2 weeks what our grandparents received in roughly about 2 years, is what they're saying. So if all organs start to get full, starts with the liver, and then all of a sudden the gut microbes start to die off because of some of these that are going directly into the gut. And then we have all of this environment that is ready to make or to help some of the more harmful bacteria grow. And then we have, again, going to the direct pathway to the brain. Our microbiome pathways that speak with the brain, and they all go to the same area, which is called the amygdala, which is actually right now being studied as questioning in some studies. The amygdala is what is actually causing autism. There's a they call the word I'm looking for an anomaly. So they have like a malformation of the amygdala. But if 4 pathways of inflammation are going straight to the amygdala, which is the control portion of memory, of behavior, and of speech in some ways because of memory, look at these that are linked to the amygdala. These are not autism symptoms. These are health symptoms. And so how do we help our bodies function more effectively? Is it by giving them a pill? If you were to start to supplement for toxicity, you're not doing things at all in their external and internal environment from the foundations up, you're actually on a maintenance plan. I've literally had people join our program that you're going to be having a nice chat about that looked at, that we're talking maybe MAPS doctors or functional doctors, and they said you're going to be on these forever. Because if the basis of anatomy from a chemistry, a cellular perspective, this is kind of where you. So I hope that explains that. And then the last area that I'm going to talk about is, all right, I have a new little friend here. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is nutrients. So these people think that they can supplement. They can give their child L-carnitine, L-theanine, all these things. And the truth is that your gut, your microbiome actually decides on your supplement absorption. It's why some supplements work so well with some kids and then others have massive reactions. But what is the point of nutrients from food? When we're feeding the microbiome and it's having its babies and it's proliferating, it will actually start to absorb even more of the nutrients. Now, not only that, some nutrients are actually killed in the stomach, or when we cook them, they can be depleted. But ideally, what we're getting is a food-first approach of a combination of whole foods, raw and cooked, and these are going to the microbiome and then coming up to the brain. Now, why is this so important? Why is this is the other thing that most don't talk about. The area of need. So we've talked about the liver and we've talked about the gut, but we've talked about how all of this goes up to the brain. But now let's talk about the thing missing in the brain, which is the nutrients needed to build out neuroreceptors and neurotransmitters, and these are not built in the body without the food. So I'll give an example. Omega-3s, everyone seems to know about, but they don't know how they work in the body. Omega-3s are basically the foundation of building the area in the brain that the messaging that we're getting from external sources, so words, colors, all of these things are being attached in information to a neuron, a neuroreceptor site. You don't need to know the science, but you just need to know that omega-3s build these out. And guess what? We don't make omega-3s naturally in our body. We need to ingest them. And supplementing omega-3s does not mean you're getting all of it. And again, you're on a maintenance plan at that point. So eating foods that provide both conversion of ALA to DHA, or even if you want to skip that whole conversion, you can eat seaweed. That will actually have some omega-3s already pre-converted to DHA. But you need the fibers from those foods to actually absorb better. And so there's a big difference, and we see it in our program all the time. It's why a food-first approach works. You can still supplement together to like gaps. But why is this also important for other nutrients? So I talked about one. Now let's talk about minerals. Let's talk about vitamin C. Let's talk about antioxidants. So cofactors, okay, are really important, and we don't talk about these enough when we talk about autism. Cofactors are literally the answer to sensory processing disorder. And at the beginning, they're going to increase sensory sensations that cause a little bit of deregulation, and that is normal. And so imagine if you were using an iron supplement versus a food-first approach, where it's being, like the body's being bombarded by these. And so there are huge transition periods. I'll even vulnerably say that I went through an iron deficiency moment, and I was supplementing with iron, and my hearing and my taste buds completely changed for 2 weeks. And that is sort of the things that we're not talking about. We are talking about these little bodies that are so much more sensitive to us. I'm an adult. My absorption of vitamins is going to be different than the high absorption of a child with a big open connection in the vagus nerve. I couldn't even imagine if I gave that to a child on the spectrum, what would have happened. So knowing these moments, knowing how powerful supplementation is, it is a tool that can be used, and we do sometimes use it in the program. But if you do not have the foundations first, number one, are they absorbing? We don't know. Or are they absorbing too much and causing issues? Sometimes. Whereas when we take a food-first approach, the fibers slow down the absorption of nutrients. They only take what they need or can take at that time, and the rest is excreted. And then the more that we continue on this process, the more that we're going to see better speech, sensory processing, And I wanted to end this one because for picky eaters, this is probably, if you have a picky or sensory or ARFID eater, when you address the nutrition part, almost right away, once this gets addressed by default, this gets addressed, sensory processing gets addressed, comorbidities, and recurrent infection because the immune system gets better. And then lastly, these things, oh, and this also corrects itself. So it's a chain reaction if you have a child who is struggling. So I hope that that gives you a little bit of a thought process, a paradigm shift on how we want to look at the human body for autism, because we're not addressing it. All we're focusing on right now in our world is the external environment, in the sense of we want them to be accepted. And of course, every child deserves acceptance. I wouldn't ever say it any other way. But there are children who are suffering so much right now that their parents aren't sleeping, the children are unable to cope, to even live in this world in a way that feels good to anyone. And these are the children that are being and so we have to, at that point, really look at the internal environment, especially when these are the issues and not autism. Okay, all wish for high functioning kids. We all want our children to live their life and be independent. So I hope that this video helps you to just prepare for our call, and I cannot wait to see you, or myself or Michelle will see you, and we will chat soon. Whoop. All right, I thought I would end with this, or this might be in a different part of the video, but I want to talk about the food as medicine. And when people say, if it's just food, I can figure it out, this is actually not true. It took me 8 years to learn all the different aspects of food. And if you look at functional physicians and functional therapists, and even looking at MAPS doctors, they actually don't understand and have the education of which foods stimulate the different organs and the different production of different nutrient cofactors that are needed, which is really interesting because we've gone so far into a pill approach that what is being taught even to practitioners is a pill first approach. So I want to shift that a little bit into why is food as medicine. So food itself will create and ferment a little bit in the gut and create the environment for Lactobacillus planta, bifidobacteriums, and basically a lot of other probiotic environments that are going to help your child build up their microbiome. I get a lot of people who ask me about lactobacillus. How come my child on their tests always have no lactobacillus? And I'm like, well, do they eat vegetables? Because Lactobacillus planta is literally from vegetables. So even if you were to put a probiotic in, for example, you're just creating an environment, but if you don't feed it, it's not going to live. So you're going to continue to test really low without the food. Food as medicine stimulates liver function. Remember I talked about liver function? The liver is a really important part of this process that a lot of families ignore a little bit or just aren't told about. So I do a lot of emphasis on helping support liver phase 1 and phase 2, and there are specific foods for that. Now, I'm not telling you the foods right now just because it depends on your child's needs, and it depends on if they have oxalate issues or if they have candida. So there are a couple things that we need to ask more questions and dive deeper into our assessment process. Better cellular bioavailability. Our food is the most biological source of energy that we have on this planet. And the fact that we try to ignore that is always crazy to me, because it literally is what our cellular structures are made to digest. Lastly, cofactors for the brain come from the nutrients that we get from food. And these are brought up to the brain via transport from gut, liver, up to the brain. And cofactors are what are going to help with our children's dopamine loops and all of their production of serotonin and hormones. And of course, what you eat literally builds out cells and organs. If you're eating a very high processed diet, are you building your body properly? It's a really simple question with a very simple answer, and the answer is no. So when people ask me why I take a food first approach, it's actually because it's food that's the medicine, and the rest is exactly as it's called, which is a supplemental factor to help this as you're doing it, to make it work a little better. And supplements are not our first approach, but they're definitely there as a support and a tool if people need them. So anyways, I hope that this makes sense to you. So happy to have you join us on the call. Can't wait.